So far it's been fun though, so that's good. So okay, let's go.
Hi, that works. Hi, Dr. Peterson. I was raised Catholic, and anytime there was a bit of an inherent contradiction, let's call it, in the documents of the Bible, it would be referred to as a mystery. And there's one mystery I've always kind of wondered about, and it's very important to Genesis. How do you deal with a perfect God, or the conception of a perfect God, who by nature is incapable of an imperfect design? Or incapable of a perfect design. So what I mean by that is many religions present, for example, good and evil as separate deities that pre-existed simultaneously. What's interesting about Christianity is that Lucifer, the embodiment of evil in the Christian religion, is an outgrowth of God. And is sometimes, Milton, for example, presents him as a rebel against his interpretation of God's tyranny, right? Another example, we didn't touch on Eden today, but in paradise, supposedly perfect garden, a perfect design, is infiltrated again by that evil outgrowth of a so-called perfect God. So from a psychological perspective, do you think there's a significance to this presentation of perfection, yet the contradictory flaws that are sort of naturally part of that perfection, quote unquote?
Oh, so good. That's a good, simple question.
We're starting good.
See, Carl Jung, he was kind of Manichaean in his approach, and he tended towards thinking that evil, in some sense, was a separate entity. And I thought about that for a long time, because there's a potency about evil that just can't be brushed away. And I mean this most practically, as I've said, for people in my clinical practice, I've dealt with many people who are touched by malevolence, and there's no other way of stating it properly. And this happens a lot to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, they encountered someone that wanted to hurt them for the sake of hurting them. It wasn't some misunderstanding. You can forget about that. It wasn't that at all. And so to deny the reality of evil in some sense, I think, is the ultimate in naivety, even though it's a word that you won't hear used, for example, very often in universities anymore. But I just can't understand that at all. But I thought about that a lot, and so I'm going to kind of answer that question by hitting it scattershot. The first thing is that there's an idea, and this happens in Milton, that comes across in Milton, that distance from God is hell. Right? That hell doesn't actually have any, it's ambivalent in Milton, but the fundamental claim seems to be that the farther you get from God, the more it's hell. And then there's another idea that Milton's Satan, who's Lucifer, the bringer of light, right? He's God's highest angel, gone most wrong. And I kind of think about him as the spirit of rationality, of intelligence. It's not because I'm not an admirer of intelligence, because hooray for intelligence, but one of the things that Milton seemed to cotton on to before the rise of modern totalitarian states was that intellect has the capacity to fall in love with its own creations and to elevate them to the highest place, which is basically a totalitarian claim. It's like, what I know is everything that needs to be known, and if it was only manifest in the world would become a utopia. And I also think that's, and we'll talk about this next week, I also think that that's the core idea behind the Tower of Babel. Remember, the Tower of Babel is raised by human beings so that the pinnacle will hit heaven. And so it's the idea that we can build a structure that makes the transcendent unnecessary. And so, okay, so there's those two things. Then there's an idea of free will that's associated with it too. And it seems to me that in order for there to be good, there has to be evil. And so I think the answer is something like this, is that in order for there to be being, there has to be limitation. In order for there to be good, there has to be the possibility of evil. I think the right path is to exist such that the possibility of evil remains open, but that you choose the good. And I don't think that evil per se is built into the structure of the world. I do think that that's human. I think that evil is human. And I think it's understandable. I did a lecture that's online about the distinction between evil and tragedy. And tragedy seems to be built into the structure of the world, and perhaps you can blame God for that. It doesn't seem to me that it's your fault that there are earthquakes, for example. But it is not obvious to me either that it's tragedy that takes the spirit out of people. I think that human beings are actually equipped to deal with tragedy, but we're not equipped to deal with malevolence. That destroys people. And so I think that Metaphysically speaking, the world is structured so that people have a choice between good and evil. And that, so then the next question is why do we have a choice? And that's where my knowledge runs out. Like the alchemists, for example, speculated that, and the Orthodox Christians also follow this line of reasoning, is that human beings in some sense are furthering creation by our actions and by our choices. And I think there's something to that. It's like creation is unfinished in some sense, and that we're participating in moving it in whatever direction it is that we want to move it. And part of that is that we have free will, and part of that is that we have the choice between good and evil. And that's also all associated with the significance, maybe the cosmic significance of our lives. And that strikes me as plausible. And I think the weight of responsibility that people feel existentially is an indication of that. So that's about the best I could do with that. So.
And it seems the way you're describing it, it's built into at least the text that you presented, because one of the other things I'd noticed was God consistently describes creation as good, right? He creates light, it's good. He creates dark, it's good.
Oh, okay.
After he creates things, he announces that he creates man and woman and announces that they have dominion over those things and can use them.
Yes.
And it might be something lost to translation, but that is described as very good.
Yes.
As soon as that dominion is brought into existence,
yes, right, exactly.
It might speak to that notion of furthering
yes,
creation.
Well, and here's something interesting too, and we'll develop this a lot, is that, you see, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, the snake gives them the fruit, the first thing that happens is their eyes are opened, okay? And to me that means that, well, they've woken up, right? There's been an increment in their consciousness. And the next thing that happens is that they recognize that they're naked. Okay, and to recognize that you're naked is to recognize that you're vulnerable. And human beings are strange creatures, because most animals are like this, and they're protected, but not us. Like, our most vulnerable parts are displayed for harm and for everyone to observe, right? So we've got that sort of bipedal self-consciousness built into us. But what's really interesting is that when Adam and Eve realize that they're naked, it's the same moment that they know the difference between good and evil. And that, God, I just ground away on that for years, trying to figure, what's going on here? What's the relationship between consciousness, knowledge of nakedness, and the knowledge of good and evil? And then I think I figured it out. I think it was that, you see, when you know that you're vulnerable, and they also develop knowledge of death, right? So there's deep knowledge of vulnerability, and they get embarrassed about that. They cover themselves up, right? So that's culture. So it's a very profound shock for them to recognize that they're naked. It even makes Adam hide from God. And then they develop the knowledge of good and evil. Well, I think it's because, you see, human beings have this peculiar capacity that no other creature has, which is, I know how I can be hurt. Because I'm aware of my own limitations, painfully aware. And now, because I know how I can be hurt, I know how you can be hurt. And I can take advantage of that. And that's, I think, how evil enters the world. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, I've got this expansion of knowledge. It says in Genesis that gives people another attribute of divinity, knowing the difference between good and evil. It has nothing to do with animals, and it has nothing to do with Adam and Eve prior to having their eyes opened. But the cosmos switches when that self-consciousness manifests itself. And that's when the possibility of evil enters the world. It's something like that. And that's also echoed by the intimate relationship between the snake in the Garden of Eden and Satan, which is, we'll go into, because that's a very strange association. It's like this snake also becomes the adversary of being. And I think that's, I'll jump very quickly into that, but I think that's because, you know, there's the snake that bites you in the jungle, and then there's the snake that lives in your enemy, and then there's the snake that lives in your family if you've banished the enemy to the Netherlands. And then there's the snake that lives in you if you remove yourself from your family. And that snake that's in you, right, that's a psychological phenomena. That's equivalent to transcendent evil itself, the thing that inhabits every single person. That's why there's that association between the snake and Satan. And that's why I think that people have this, it's associated with our knowledge of vulnerability that gives us this constant capacity for evil. I mean, imagine if you're a medieval torturer. You know, I mean, people don't generally imagine that sort of thing, but people were medieval torturers, and they were very good at what they did. And the only way that you can be a torturer is to know what would hurt you, right? And so you exploit your own vulnerability, you exploit the knowledge of your own vulnerability to bring pain into the world. And I don't think that you can lay that precisely at God's feet. Now, people have been arguing about that for a very long time, but my question, the question for me that arose from that is, all right, fine, like tragedy, you can lay that at God's feet. Well, if we didn't bring additional evil into the world, could we tolerate the tragedy of being without becoming corrupt? And I think generally the answer to that is yes, because I've seen people react quite heroically to the arbitrary burdens of their life. But malevolence, man, that lays them low. It lays them low, and it seems to be nothing but a destructive force. And I do believe as well, and I think you see this in the Cain and Abel story, that the root of malevolence is the desire for revenge against God for creation itself. And I mean, I've read terrible things written by terrible people trying to get to the bottom of things. And I mentioned the Columbine killers, for example. And it's clear, all you have to do is go read what they wrote. What they were doing was taking revenge against God. They knew that. It wasn't unconscious. They'd been dwelling on this for months, plotting their revenge. And it was revenge against being itself for the crime of being. So.
Thank you.